The drums stopped. That was the first sign that something was wrong. For 3 nights the village of Hallowmere had beaten the sacrifice drums without pause, a steady rhythm meant to warn every creature in the forest that the offering was coming. Ilara Whitlock had grown up hearing that rhythm every 10 years, always for someone else's daughter. She never imagined she would be the one walking barefoot through the mud while it echoed behind her, and now, without warning, it had gone silent. The silence was worse than the noise had ever been. She stood at the edge of the tree line with her wrists bound in pale rope, wearing a plain white dress that had been sewn for her only that morning. Behind her, the village elders watched from a safe distance, their torches flickering, their faces unreadable. None of them looked at her directly. They had learned, over generations, that it was easier to send a girl to her fate if you did not have to see her eyes. Ilara turned once to look back at them. She was not crying. She had cried the night before, alone in her room, until there were no tears left. Now there was only a hard, cold feeling in her chest, like a stone that had replaced her heart. She would not give the elders the satisfaction of watching her break. If this was truly the end, she decided she would meet it standing. "Walk," said the head elder, a thin man named Cormac Ashby, without stepping any closer to her. "The Alpha does not like to wait." She walked. The forest beyond Hallowmere was called the Hollow Wood, and no one from the village had entered it and returned in living memory. Children were told stories about it before they could even speak in full sentences, stories of a creature so massive it could tear down an oak tree with a single blow, a creature with eyes like burning coals, and a voice that could stop a grown man's heart. The monster Alpha, they called him. Once every decade, when the moon turned red over the Hollow Wood, the village was required to send an unmarried woman into the trees as a sacrifice, to keep the creature satisfied, and the village safe from his wrath. It was a pact older than anyone could remember, written into the very founding of Hallowmere, and no one had ever dared to break it. Ilara had always believed the stories were exaggerated, the way most old fears become larger with each retelling. She had told herself, in the quiet hours before dawn, that whatever waited in the Hollow Wood was probably just a large animal, or a bandit, who had built himself a fearsome reputation to keep people away from his hideout. She told herself this because it was easier than imagining the alternative. But now, standing at the edge of the trees, with the drums silent and the night pressing in around her, her carefully built calm began to crack. The path into the forest was barely a path at all, more a suggestion of one, worn thin by 10 years of neglect since the last sacrifice had walked it. Roots rose out of the ground like curled fingers, and the canopy overhead was so thick that no moonlight reached the forest floor. Ilara moved slowly, testing each step, her bound hands held out in front of her for balance. Every sound made her flinch, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. She was aware, with a sharpness she had never felt before, of every part of her own body, her racing heart, the tightness in her throat, the way her bare feet ached against the cold ground. She did not know how long she walked. Time seemed to stretch and fold in on itself inside the trees. At some point the path widened into a small clearing, and there, in the center, stood a single stone altar, worn smooth by centuries of rain. This, she understood without being told, was where she was meant to wait. She had been left here before, on other years, other girls standing where she now stood, and none of them had ever come home to tell the story. Ilara climbed onto the altar and sat down, refusing to kneel. If the creature wanted to devour her, she decided, it would have to do so while she looked it directly in the eye. She would not cower. She would not beg. Whatever waited for her in the dark, she would meet it with her chin raised. The clearing was silent for a long while, long enough that Ilara began to wonder if this was some cruel trick, if she was simply meant to sit here until she wasted away, forgotten by everyone who had once claimed to love her, long enough that a small, treacherous part of her began to hope that nothing would come at all. Then the trees at the far edge of the clearing began to move. It was not the gentle sway of wind through branches. It was something heavier, something deliberate, as though the forest itself were parting to let something enormous pass through. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the edge of the altar with her bound hands, her knuckles turning white, and forced herself to stay seated, to stay still, even as every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. A shape emerged from the darkness between two ancient oaks. It was tall, taller than any man Alara had ever seen, tall enough that it had to duck slightly to clear the lowest branches. In the darkness, she could not make out every detail, only an impression of broad shoulders, of a powerful frame, wrapped in something like fur and shadow, of eyes that caught what little light there was and glowed faintly, the color of amber held up to a flame. It moved with a strange, controlled grace, nothing like the clumsy stumbling of the monsters in her childhood stories. This was not a mindless beast. This was something that thought, something that chose each step with purpose. Alara's heart pounded so hard she was certain the creature could hear it. She wanted to run, but some deep, stubborn part of her refused to let fear win completely, and so she stayed seated on the altar, her spine straight, her eyes fixed on the approaching shape. The creature stopped several paces away, close enough now that Alara could see more clearly. He was not the shapeless monster of legend. He had the form of a man, broad and powerfully built, but there was something undeniably other about him. The faint glow of his eyes, the way shadows seemed to cling to him even where there should have been none, the sense of contained power radiating off him like heat from a fire. His dark hair was long and unbound, and his expression, when she finally saw it clearly, was not hungry or cruel. It was watchful, curious even. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Alara refused to be the first to break the silence, though every part of her wanted to demand answers, to ask what he intended to do with her, to hope for a mercy she did not truly believe existed. Instead, she simply stared back at him, matching his gaze with a defiance that surprised even herself. "You are not afraid," the creature said at last. His voice was low, rough, but there was nothing monstrous in the way he formed the words. It was, if anything, startlingly calm. "I am afraid," Alara answered, her voice steadier than she expected. "I am simply choosing not to show it to you." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or the faintest trace of amusement. "The others cried out," he said. "They wept and pleaded before I ever reached them. You have done neither. Would it have changed anything if I had? No. Then there was no reason to waste my breath on it." The creature tilted his head slightly, studying her the way one might study an unfamiliar puzzle. He circled the altar slowly, and Alara turned her head to keep him in sight, refusing to let him move behind her, out of view. She was not going to give him an easy opportunity to catch her off guard. "You misunderstand why you are here," he said finally, coming to a stop in front of her once more. "Enlighten me then," Alara said. "Since I am apparently the newest offering, I would like to understand the reasoning." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "You are not an offering to be consumed. You are a wife." For a moment, Alara was certain she had misheard him. The words did not fit into any shape her mind had prepared for. She had steeled herself for the worst outcome the old stories described, not for this. "A wife," she repeated slowly, as though testing the word for some hidden trap. "Yes. I do not know you. I do not even know your name." "Kale," he said, "and you are Alara Whitlock. I know a great deal about you already, though you know nothing of me. That will change, in time." Alara felt something hot rise in her chest, something closer to anger than fear now. "I did not agree to this. I was not asked. I was bound, and walked into these trees like livestock led to market. And now you tell me I am to be your wife, as though that should comfort me. I did not say it should comfort you. Then what do you expect from me? Gratitude? Obedience?" Kale's amber eyes held hers, unblinking. "I expect nothing from you tonight but your presence. What you choose to give beyond that is entirely your own decision. And if I refuse, you cannot return to Hallowmere. The pact does not allow it." Alara's jaw tightened. She thought of the elders standing safely beyond the tree line, of Cormac Ashby refusing to meet her eyes, of a village that had built its entire safety on the backs of girls just like her, offered up every 10 years without a single vote in their own fate. Something inside her, already raw and bruised from the walk through the forest, hardened into something close to resolve. "Then understand this now, Kale. Whatever you are," she said, rising from the altar despite her bound wrists, refusing to remain seated beneath him a moment longer. "I did not choose to come here. I do not know your customs, and I owe you no loyalty, simply because your kind decided, generations ago, that my life could be traded for the safety of people who never once tried to protect me. If you intend to keep me, you may do so. But I will not bow to you. Not tonight, and not on any night that follows. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant call of some night bird and the soft creak of branches overhead. Ilara half expected anger in response, some flash of the fearsome temper the old stories had warned her about. Instead, Cale studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not offense, but a kind of quiet, unreadable interest, as though she had said something he had been waiting a very long time to hear. "Good," he said simply. The single word caught her off guard, more than any threat could have. "Good?" she echoed, wary now, certain she had misunderstood him a second time. "I have had enough of fear," Cale said, and for the briefest instant, something old and tired passed behind his glowing eyes, something that looked almost like loneliness. "Come. It is a long walk to where you will sleep tonight, and the forest is not gentle to those who linger after dark." He did not reach for her. He did not command her forward with force. He simply turned, expecting her to follow, and after a moment of hesitation, weighing her few remaining choices in the darkness of the hollow wood, Ilara stepped down from the altar and followed him into the trees, her bound hands clenched at her sides, her chin still lifted, refusing, even now, even here, to let herself be anything less than unafraid. They walked for what felt like an hour, following a trail only Cale seemed able to see. The forest around them changed as they moved deeper in. The trees grew taller and stranger, their bark pale as bone in some places, and dark as ash in others. Small lights drifted between the branches, faint and blue, and Ilara realized with a start that they were not fireflies, but something else entirely, something that pulsed in rhythm like a heartbeat. "What are those?" she asked before she could stop herself, curiosity overpowering her caution. "Marsh lights," Cale answered without turning around. "They mark the boundary of my territory. They will not harm you, as long as you stay close to me." "Is that a warning?" "It is a fact." Ilara studied his broad back as they walked, trying to piece together the shape of the creature who had just claimed her as his wife. He did not walk like a monster. He walked like someone who was tired, who carried a weight she could not yet see. She found herself, despite every reasonable instinct telling her not to, growing curious about that weight. "Why does the pact exist at all?" she asked. "Why does your kind need a human wife every 10 years? Cale was quiet for a long moment before answering. "That is a longer story than tonight allows. You will have your answers, Ilara Whitlock, but not all of them, and not yet." She wanted to press further, but exhaustion was beginning to catch up with her, dragging at her limbs like wet sand. The adrenaline that had carried her through the walk into the forest was fading now, leaving behind only bone-deep tiredness. She stumbled once over a root, and before she could catch herself, Cale's hand shot out and steadied her by the elbow, his grip firm but careful, as though he were holding something breakable, despite her earlier defiance. "Careful," he said quietly. Ilara pulled her arm free the moment her footing was secure, unwilling to accept even small kindnesses from him so easily. "I do not need help." "No," Cale agreed, something almost like humor in his voice now. "I do not imagine you do." They walked on, and slowly, through the trees ahead, Ilara began to see lights, not the strange blue marsh lights but warm, golden ones, glowing from somewhere deep within the forest. As they drew closer, the shape of a structure began to emerge from the darkness, vast and ancient, built into the side of a hill, and half swallowed by roots and stone. It looked less like a den and more like a fortress that had grown out of the earth itself, older than any building Ilara had ever seen in Halomir. "This is where you will live now," Cale said, stopping at the edge of the clearing to let her take it in. Ilara stared up at the towering structure, at the flickering lights in windows too high to be climbed, at the strange carvings etched into the stone archway that marked its entrance, symbols she did not recognize but that seemed to hum faintly with old power. Fear and wonder tangled together in her chest, impossible to separate from one another. "It is not what I expected," she admitted quietly. "Little about tonight has been what you expected," Cale said. "That will not change tomorrow." He led her forward, beneath the archway, and Ilara stepped over the threshold, into her new life, with her wrists still bound, her heart still pounding, and her resolve, despite everything, still unbroken. Whatever waited for her inside those ancient walls, she promised herself she would face it the same way she had faced the altar in the clearing, standing, unafraid, and refusing to bow. Morning came slowly inside the stone fortress, filtering through narrow windows in soft gray light. Alara had not expected to sleep at all, yet somewhere in the depths of the night, exhaustion had finally won against fear, and she woke stiff and disoriented, in a chamber she did not recognize. The room was larger than any bedroom she had ever slept in, carved directly from the hillside, with woven tapestries covering the stone walls, and a bed piled high with furs. Her wrists, she noticed, were no longer bound. Someone had removed the rope while she slept. She sat up quickly, heart hammering, scanning the room for any sign of Cale. He was nowhere to be seen. A simple dress had been laid across a wooden chair near the door, along with a basin of clean water. Alara approached it cautiously, half expecting some trick, but found nothing, except what it appeared to be, a plain offering of comfort. She dressed slowly, her mind racing through everything that had happened the night before, trying to decide how much of it had been real, and how much a product of her own exhausted imagination. It had all been real. The ache in her feet from the long walk confirmed it. When she finally worked up the courage to open the heavy wooden door, she found a corridor lit by the same strange blue lights she had seen in the forest, embedded now into small alcoves along the stone walls. She followed the corridor cautiously, one hand trailing along the cold stone, until it opened into a wide hall, filled with the low murmur of voices. The voices stopped the moment she appeared. A dozen or more figures turned to look at her, and Alara froze in the doorway, suddenly aware of how small and out of place she must look among them. They were not ordinary people. Some had the same faint glow to their eyes that Cale did. Others stood with a kind of stillness that felt distinctly unnatural, as though they were listening to sounds far beyond human hearing. All of them watched her with open curiosity, and none of it felt friendly. "So this is her," said a voice from the back of the hall, smooth and mocking. A tall man with sharp features and dark eyes stepped forward, studying Alara the way a merchant might study a horse, before deciding whether it was worth the price. The new sacrifice. "I am not a sacrifice," Alara said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the dozens of unfamiliar eyes fixed on her. "Not anymore, apparently. I am told I am a wife." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the hall, none of it kind. The sharp-featured man tilted his head, amused. "A wife," he repeated. "How fortunate for you." "Draven." Cale's voice cut through the hall like a blade before Alara could respond. He appeared from a side corridor, and the entire room seemed to straighten in his presence, shoulders squaring, voices dropping. Even Draven's mocking smile faltered slightly, though it did not disappear entirely. "You will treat her with the respect owed to my chosen wife, or you will answer to me." "Of course, Alpha," Draven said smoothly, bowing his head just enough to seem respectful, while somehow managing to convey the opposite. His eyes flicked back to Alara, sharp and assessing. "Welcome to the pack." Alara held his gaze without flinching, though something about the way he looked at her sent an uneasy chill down her spine. She said nothing, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of a reaction, and turned her attention instead to Cale, who was crossing the hall toward her. "You should have waited for me before leaving your chamber," Cale said, though there was no real anger in his tone, only something closer to concern. "I am not in the habit of waiting for permission to move through my own home," Alara replied evenly. "Even a home I did not choose." Something flickered across Cale's face, and for a moment, Alara thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, as though he were fighting back something close to approval. "Come," he said instead. "There are things you should understand, and it is better you hear them from me than from whispers in these halls." He led her from the hall, ignoring the curious stares that followed them, and Alara felt the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes on her back as they went. Draven's gaze, in particular, lingered longest, and something about it made her skin crawl in a way she could not quite explain. Cale brought her to a smaller room, more private, with a single window that looked out over the vast expanse of the hollow wood. Sunlight filtered weakly through the leaves outside, painting the room in soft green light. He gestured for her to sit, though she remained standing, arms crossed, waiting. "The pact between my kind and Halomir is older than either of us," Cale began. "It was made generations ago, after a terrible war between my people and yours. The details of that war are not important tonight. What matters is that the pact was meant to ensure peace. Every 10 years, a bond is formed between my line and a woman of the village, to remind both sides that peace requires sacrifice from everyone, not just one side. That sounds like a convenient story told by whoever benefits most from it, Alara said. What happened to the women who came before me? Cale's expression grew heavier, something like old grief settling into the lines of his face. Some accepted their place here, and lived long lives among my people. Others did not survive the transition. The forest is not always gentle to those unfamiliar with its dangers. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one I have. Alara studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of deception, and found none, which somehow unsettled her more than if she had. And Draven? What is his place here, if not simply another member of your pack? Draven believes the old ways should be abandoned, Cale said carefully. He believes strength should decide who leads, not bloodline or tradition. He has never hidden his ambitions from me. And yet you allow him to remain close to you. It is easier to watch an enemy who stands beside you than one who hides in shadow. Alara considered this, filing it away, alongside everything else she had learned in the span of a single night. The world she had known in Halomir, with its simple fears and simple rules, felt impossibly distant now, replaced by something far more complicated and far more dangerous. She thought of Draven's mocking smile, of the way the entire hall had gone silent the moment Cale entered, of the strange power humming through the stone walls around her. You still have not explained why I cannot simply refuse this, she said finally. Why I cannot leave, if I choose to. You are free to leave this room whenever you wish, Cale said. You are free to walk these halls, to speak your mind, to refuse whatever you do not wish to accept. I will not force obedience from you, Alara, but leaving the forest entirely is not the same question, and it is not one I can answer honestly, without frightening you further. Try me, Alara said. I have survived a great deal already in the span of one night. Cale studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind his glowing eyes, before he finally spoke again. The pact binds more than tradition. It binds magic older than either of us fully understands. Should you attempt to leave the boundaries of the hollow wood before the bond between us is settled, the same magic that brought you here would turn against you. I do not say this to frighten you into staying. I say it because you deserve the truth, even when it is unwelcome. Alara felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, though she had not moved at all. She had spent the night preparing herself for monsters, for claws and teeth, and instead, she found herself trapped by something far less visible and far more difficult to fight. An old magic she did not understand, wrapped around her like invisible chains. Then I suppose, she said slowly, forcing her voice to remain steady, I will simply have to learn everything I can about the chains holding me here, so that one day, I might find a way to break them. Cale's expression shifted again, that same unreadable interest from the night before returning to his face. I would expect nothing less from you, he said quietly, and though his words were simple, something in the way he said them made Alara wonder, for the first time, whether the creature the villagers called a monster might understand her defiance better than anyone in Halomir ever had. Days inside the fortress fell into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Alara rose each morning, not knowing what to expect, and each morning brought some new piece of the world she had been thrust into, unfamiliar and unsettling in equal measure. She learned the names of some among the pack, though most kept their distance, watching her with the same wary curiosity one might show a wild animal that had wandered into camp. Only a few showed anything close to warmth, among them, a young woman named Bryn, who worked in the kitchens and seemed entirely unbothered by the strangeness of Alara's presence. You are the first one who has argued with Draven on her first day here, Bryn said one morning, setting a bowl of warm porridge in front of Alara at the long wooden table. Most of the others were too frightened to speak at all. Should I have been frightened? Alara asked. Bryn considered this, tilting her head thoughtfully. Frightened, yes. Silent, no. There is a difference. Alara found herself smiling faintly at that, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since leaving Halomir. Bryn was human, she had learned. Born within the fortress to a mother who had come generations before, as part of an older pact, and had simply stayed. choosing this strange life over the one she might have had beyond the forest. It gave Alara a small, uncertain flicker of hope, proof that survival here was possible, even if it remained unclear what shape that survival might eventually take. Kale, for his part, kept a careful distance during those first days, appearing only briefly to check on her, before disappearing again into whatever duties occupied an Alpha's time. Alara told herself she was relieved by this distance. She did not want his company, did not want to grow comfortable in a place she had never chosen. And yet, some small and unwelcome part of her noticed his absence more than she wished to admit. It was on the fourth day that everything shifted. Alara had wandered further from her chamber than she intended, drawn by curiosity toward a section of the fortress she had not yet explored, a long gallery lined with old paintings and carvings, depicting figures she did not recognize. She was studying one particularly striking image, a woman standing before a great wolf, with her hand raised, not in fear, but in command, when a voice spoke from close behind her. "You should not wander here alone." Alara turned sharply to find Draven leaning against the stone archway, arms crossed, watching her, with that same sharp, assessing expression she remembered from the hall on her first morning. "I was not aware certain parts of my new home were forbidden to me," she said evenly, refusing to let him see how quickly her pulse had jumped at his sudden appearance. "Not forbidden," Draven said, pushing off the archway and moving closer with an unhurried, predatory grace. "Simply unwise. Not everyone here shares our Alpha's patience with human defiance." "Is that a threat?" "A warning." Draven's dark eyes moved over her with open calculation. "You have made quite an impression in a short time, Alara Whitlock. Kale has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you in a very long while. Some among us find that troubling." "I did not ask to be looked at in any particular way," Alara said. "I did not ask for any of this." "And yet here you are." Draven's voice dropped lower, something almost gentle threading through the words, though Alara did not trust it for a moment. "Tell me, has he explained to you what happens if the bond between you fails? What becomes of a wife who is rejected, rather than chosen?" Alara's stomach tightened, though she kept her expression carefully blank. "He has told me enough." "Has he?" Draven smiled, slow and knowing. "Then you understand the stakes far better than I gave you credit for. Perhaps you are not as unprepared as you appear." Before Alara could respond, a low growl rumbled through the gallery, and both of them turned to find Kale standing at the far end, his expression thunderous, in a way Alara had not yet witnessed. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier in an instant, charged with something ancient and dangerous. "Draven," Kale said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will leave, now." Draven's smile did not waver, though he inclined his head in a mockery of respect and stepped back from Alara, putting a careful distance between them. "Of course, Alpha. I was merely welcoming your new wife to her home." He glanced once more at Alara, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "We will speak again soon, I am sure." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps unhurried and confident, even under Kale's furious gaze. Once he was gone, the tension in the room did not fully ease, and Alara found herself studying Kale carefully, noting the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "You should not be alone with him," Kale said finally, his voice rough with restrained anger. "I did not invite his company," Alara said, "and I am capable of managing a conversation, even an unpleasant one, without your intervention. That is not the concern." Kale crossed the room, stopping close enough that Alara had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. "Draven does not simply dislike you, Alara. He sees you as a means to an end. If he believed harming you would weaken my position among the pack, he would not hesitate." The words settled over Alara like a cold weight, and for the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself to feel the full danger of her situation, not just the strangeness of it. "Why does my presence threaten his position at all?" Kale was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, replaced by something more weary. "Because a bonded Alpha, one whose wife survives and stays willingly, grows stronger. The pack senses it, respects it. Draven has spent years building support among those who believe the old pact is a weakness rather than a strength. Your survival, your defiance, undermines everything he has worked toward." "So I am not simply a wife," Alara said slowly. understanding dawning cold and heavy in her chest. I am a weapon in whatever conflict already exists between the two of you. You are not a weapon, Kale said firmly. You are a person, Elara. Whatever else you become caught in the middle of. But I would be lying if I told you Draven sees you the same way I do. Elara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of the gallery. And how do you see me exactly? Kale did not answer immediately, and something in his hesitation felt more honest than any quick response could have been. I am still deciding that myself, he admitted finally. You are not what I expected when the drums called your name in Halomir. I expected fear. I expected surrender. Instead, I found someone who looked me in the eye on the night she believed she was walking to her own end, and refused to look away. The admission hung in the air between them, unexpectedly vulnerable, and Elara found herself unsure how to respond. She had built her defiance as a shield against him, against this entire forced arrangement, and yet standing here now, hearing the quiet honesty in his voice, that shield felt harder to maintain than it had on the night they first met. I meant what I said that night, she said finally, forcing steadiness back into her voice. I will not bow to you, Kale. Not out of fear, and not simply because tradition demands it. I would not want you to, Kale said, and though his tone remained even, something in his eyes suggested the words cost him more effort than he let show. But I would ask you to be careful, all the same. Draven's threats are not idle ones, and I cannot protect you from everything within these walls, however much I might wish to. Elara held his gaze for a long moment, weighing the strange tangle of danger and honesty that seemed to define every conversation between them. Then perhaps, she said slowly, you should teach me to protect myself, rather than relying entirely on your protection. Something shifted in Kale's expression at that, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like respect. That, he said, is the first request you have made of me since your arrival. Do not grow used to it, Elara warned, though there was less bite in her words than she intended. I would not dream of it, Kale said, and for the briefest moment, something that might have been the beginning of a real smile touched his face before he turned and led her from the gallery, leaving the old paintings and their unreadable warnings behind them, in the dim, watchful silence of the fortress. True to his word, Kale began teaching her in the days that followed, though not in the way Elara had first imagined. She had expected weapons, perhaps, or some crude lesson in striking a blow. Instead, he brought her to a wide stone courtyard, hidden deep within the fortress, open to the sky, where morning light poured down over cracked flagstones worn smooth by generations of feet before hers. Strength is not always about force, Kale told her, standing across from her in the pale light. Among my people, the ones who survive longest are not always the strongest. They are the ones who understand how to read a room, how to sense danger before it arrives, how to move without wasting their energy on fear. That sounds like something a teacher tells a frightened student to make her feel better, Elara said, arms crossed. Perhaps, Kale allowed. It is also true. He taught her, over the following days, how to stand in a way that did not invite challenge, how to walk through the fortress halls with quiet confidence, rather than nervous uncertainty. He showed her small, practical things as well, how to identify which plants in the surrounding forest were dangerous and which were safe, how to recognize the subtle shift in a pack member's posture that signaled hostility before it became open aggression. Elara absorbed it all with a hunger that surprised her, grateful for anything that made her feel less powerless in a world she had not chosen. Bryn often watched these lessons from the edge of the courtyard, offering quiet commentary that made Elara laugh despite herself, a sound she had not expected to hear so soon after leaving everything familiar behind. Slowly, without quite meaning to, Elara found the fortress beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a place she might, eventually, learn to call home. Not everyone shared her growing sense of ease. Draven's presence lingered at the edges of her days like a persistent shadow, never quite direct enough to warrant open confrontation, but never entirely absent either. She caught him watching during meals, murmuring quietly with others in corners of the great hall, always falling silent the moment she drew near. Kale noticed it too, she could tell, though he said little about it directly, choosing instead to keep her close whenever Draven's influence seemed to grow too visible. It was nearly 2 weeks after her arrival that Alara finally worked up the courage to ask Cale the question that had been building in her since that first night in the clearing. They were walking together along the edge of the forest, close enough to the fortress to remain safe, but far enough to feel some illusion of privacy, when she finally spoke. "Tell me about the war," she said. "The one that started all of this. You said it was not important, but I think you were wrong." Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the tree line ahead of them. "It began nearly 3 centuries ago," he said finally. "My people and yours once shared this land without the boundary the hollow wood now represents. There was trade between us, even friendship, in the earliest years. But fear has a way of poisoning even the strongest bonds, and eventually the villages surrounding this forest came to see my people not as neighbors, but as a threat to be eliminated. What happened? They came in the night, when we were least prepared for battle," Cale said, his voice hardening slightly. "Many of my people died before we understood what was happening. When we finally fought back, the losses on both sides were terrible. It was only after years of bloodshed that a truce was finally reached, one built on the pact that still binds us today." Alara absorbed this in silence, trying to reconcile the story with everything Halomir had taught her about the hollow wood and its dangers. "The village never told the story that way," she said finally. "We were taught that your kind attacked first, that the pact was mercy shown to a village that had done nothing to deserve such suffering. History is often written by whoever survives to tell it," Cale said, something old and tired in his voice. "I do not say this to make you doubt everything you were raised to believe, Alara, only to help you understand that the truth is rarely as simple as either side wishes to remember it." "Do you resent me for that?" Alara asked quietly. "For being raised inside the version of the story that painted your people as monsters?" Cale turned to look at her fully then, something gentle in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "No," he said. "You did not choose the story you were raised inside, any more than I chose the burden I carry as Alpha. We are both, in our own ways, inheriting mistakes that were made long before either of us existed." Something about the honesty of his answer settled into Alara's chest, unexpectedly warm. She had spent 2 weeks bracing herself against this place, against this creature the world had taught her to fear, and yet here, standing at the edge of the forest with the afternoon light filtering through the leaves, she found it increasingly difficult to hold on to the simple hatred she had carried with her into the trees on that first terrible night. "I still do not forgive Halomir for what they did," she said finally. "For choosing me, for the drums, for all of it." "You should not have to," Cale said simply. "Forgiveness is not required of you, Alara. Not for them, and not for me." They stood together in silence for a while after that, watching the wind move through the distant trees, and for the first time since the drums had gone silent behind her, Alara felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized she was still holding on to so tightly. It was not trust, not yet, but it was, perhaps, the beginning of something that might one day grow into it. That night, as she prepared for sleep in her chamber, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Bryn standing in the corridor, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "You should know," Bryn said quietly, glancing back over her shoulder as though checking for anyone who might overhear. "Draven has been meeting with others outside the main hall. Late at night, when most of the pack is asleep. I do not know what they discuss, but I do not think it bodes well for you, or for Cale." Alara's earlier warmth cooled quickly into something more watchful. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are the first person to arrive here in a long while who has not simply accepted whatever fate was handed to her," Bryn said. "I would like to see that continue." Alara nodded slowly, filing the warning away alongside everything else Cale had already told her about Draven's ambitions. The fortress, for all its strange beauty and unexpected kindness, remained a place of shifting loyalties and hidden dangers, and she understood now, more clearly than ever, that whatever peace she had begun to find within these walls could not be taken for granted. "Thank you, Bryn," she said quietly. "I will be careful." "See that you are," Bryn said, offering a small, tired smile, before disappearing back down the corridor, leaving Alara alone with her thoughts, and the growing certainty that the true danger within the hollow wood had very little to do with the creature she had once been sent here to fear. Weeks passed, and the fortress that had once felt like a prison slowly transformed, in Alara's eyes, into something closer to a strange and complicated home. She learned the rhythms of the pack, the names of those who had once watched her with open suspicion, the hidden corners of the ancient structure, where sunlight still managed to find its way through cracks in the stone. She learned, too, the shape of Cale himself, not the towering figure of legend that had emerged from the trees on her first night, but the quieter man beneath, one who carried old burdens with a patience she had not expected from something the world called a monster. It was during a quiet evening in the courtyard, the two of them seated on the worn stone steps while the last light of day faded from the sky, that Alara noticed something different in Cale's manner. He seemed distracted, his usual steady composure cracking slightly at the edges, his eyes distant even as she spoke to him. "You are not listening to me," she observed, nudging his shoulder lightly with her own. Cale blinked, focusing on her again, with something like effort. "Forgive me. There are matters weighing on my mind." "What matters?" He hesitated, and Alara had learned, over the past weeks, to recognize the particular quality of his silences, the ones that meant he was deciding how much truth she could bear, rather than whether he trusted her with it at all. "The bond between us," he said finally, "is not yet complete. There is a ritual, one required by the old pact, that must take place before the curse protecting this pact settles fully. Without it, the magic that binds you here remains unstable, and so, in turn, does my position as Alpha." Ilara's stomach tightened at the word curse, a word he had never used so directly before. "You called it a curse, not simply a pact." Cale's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might retreat back into careful half-truths. Instead, he exhaled slowly and met her eyes directly. "The pact was built upon a curse, cast by someone my ancestors wronged greatly, generations ago. I have not told you the full truth of it, because I did not wish to burden you further than I already had. But I think, perhaps, you have earned more honesty than I have given you. Tell me," Alara said, her voice steady, despite the anxious flutter building in her chest. Cale told her, then, the story he had kept carefully guarded since the night they first met. Long ago, before the war that had shaped the current pact, a powerful woman had loved one of Cale's ancestors, an alpha of great strength and greater cruelty. When he abandoned her for the sake of political alliance, choosing power over the promises he had made her, she had cursed his bloodline in her grief and fury, binding every alpha who followed him to a fate of forced isolation, doomed to remain alone and unloved unless a human bride chose, freely and without coercion, to remain bonded to him, despite every reason to leave. "For centuries," Cale said quietly, "no bride has ever stayed by choice. They stayed out of fear, or resignation, or simple lack of alternative. The curse considers that a hollow bond, and it has never been broken. And if it is never broken, then I remain as every alpha before me has remained," Cale said, "powerful and utterly alone, watching each bride eventually grow to resent the very forest that trapped her here, until resentment becomes the only bond between us." Alara sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what he had just told her. She thought of the 10-year cycle, of the countless women before her who had walked this same path into the hollow wood, bound not simply by tradition, but by a curse designed, centuries ago, to punish an entire bloodline for the choices of a single cruel man. "You believe I might be the one to break it," she said finally, understanding settling cold and clear in her chest. "That is why you have been so careful with me, why you have taught me, protected me, given me space to make my own choices, rather than demanding obedience." "I will not lie to you," Cale said. "There is hope in me that did not exist before you arrived. But I would not have you stay simply to satisfy an old curse, Alara. If you choose to remain, it must be because you wish to, not because some ancient magic requires it of you." Alara considered this carefully, weighing the strange tangle of fear and stubborn hope that had defined every day since the drums had gone silent behind her. She thought of the elders in Halomir, of Cormac Ashby refusing to meet her eyes, of a village that had never once considered whether the women it sacrificed might have futures worth protecting. She thought too of Bryn's easy laughter, of the quiet courtyard lessons, of Cale's steady patience, even when she had given him every reason to abandon it. "I have not decided anything yet," she said honestly, "but I will tell you this. Whatever choice I eventually make, it will be mine alone, not the curse's, and not even yours. That is all I would ever ask of you, Cale said, and something in the quiet sincerity of his voice settled deeper into Alara's chest than she was fully prepared for. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching from the corridor, and both of them turned to find Bryn rushing into the courtyard, her expression tight with worry. "Alpha," she said, breathless, "you need to come. There has been an incident near the western boundary. Draven's people say it was an accident, but 2 guards were injured, and they are saying the injuries came from human hands." Cale rose immediately, his earlier openness hardening back into the controlled authority Alara had first witnessed in the Great Hall. "Show me," he said, and then, glancing back at Alara, with something between apology and concern, added, "Stay close to Bryn. I will return as soon as I am able." Alara nodded, watching him disappear down the corridor, with Bryn hurrying to keep pace, and felt the fragile peace of the evening shatter into something far more uncertain. She thought of Draven's mocking smile, of Bryn's warning about late-night meetings, and could not shake the growing certainty that whatever had happened at the western boundary was no accident at all, but the opening move in a conflict that had been building quietly for weeks, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself. She did not sleep well that night, her mind circling endlessly through everything Cale had told her, the weight of the curse, the fragile hope he had allowed himself to admit, the danger that seemed to be closing in from every direction at once. Whatever choice she eventually made about her place within these walls, she understood now that it would not be made in peace or in isolation. It would be made in the middle of a storm that had been gathering long before she ever arrived, and one that showed no sign of passing quietly. By morning, the fortress buzzed with tense, hushed conversation, and Alara found it impossible to learn the full truth of what had happened at the western boundary. Some said the injured guards had simply fallen during a routine patrol. Others whispered, more quietly, that Draven's followers had staged the entire incident to sow doubt about Cale's ability to protect the pack. Alara noticed the way conversations stopped whenever she entered a room, the way eyes followed her more closely than before, some with renewed suspicion, others with something that looked almost like pity. She found Cale in the courtyard that afternoon, his expression drawn and tired in a way she had not seen since her arrival. "What really happened?" she asked, not bothering with any gentler approach. Cale studied her for a long moment before answering. "The guards were attacked. Not by an accident, and not by any outside threat. Draven has grown bolder, testing how far he can push before I am forced to respond directly. Why would he risk open conflict? You said yourself he prefers to work through influence rather than force." "Because he senses what I feared he might," Cale said quietly. "That you are changing things here, Alara. The pack has noticed how you carry yourself, how you have refused every attempt to diminish you. Some among them have begun to speak of you with something close to respect, which Draven understands to be dangerous to everything he has built." Alara absorbed this, an uncomfortable weight settling over her shoulders. She had not asked to become a symbol in someone else's power struggle, yet here she was, caught firmly in the middle of it regardless of her wishes. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to speak with him directly," Cale said, "to remind him where the true authority within this pack still rests." That sounds like exactly the kind of confrontation he wants. Cale's jaw tightened, though he did not argue the point. "What would you suggest instead?" Alara considered this carefully, drawing on everything she had learned during their weeks of quiet lessons in the courtyard. "You have taught me that strength is not always about force," she said slowly. "Perhaps the same lesson applies here. If Draven wants conflict because he believes it will expose weakness in your leadership, then perhaps the answer is not to give him the confrontation he expects, but to remove the doubt he is trying to plant in the first place." "How would you propose I do that?" "Let the pack see the truth for themselves," Alara said. "Not through your words, but through actions. Draven cannot easily twist into doubt. Let them see that the bond between us is not the weakness he claims it to be." Cale studied her carefully, something shifting behind his amber eyes. "You are suggesting we make the bond public, before it is even settled." "I am suggesting," Alara said, "that hiding uncertainty has done nothing but give Draven room to fill the silence with whatever story serves him best. Perhaps it is time to stop hiding." Before Cale could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from the great hall beyond the courtyard. sharp and urgent enough to draw both their attention immediately. They exchanged a brief glance before hurrying toward the sound together, arriving to find the hall filled with pack members, gathered in tense clusters, all attention fixed on Draven, who stood near the center of the room addressing the crowd with practiced, confident authority. "And I ask you all, plainly," Draven was saying as they entered, "how long must we accept an alpha whose attention is consumed by an unfinished bond with a human girl, while the true dangers surrounding our territory go unaddressed? The attack on our guards was no accident. Someone within these walls grows careless, distracted by matters that have nothing to do with our safety." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, some faces sympathetic to Draven's words, others clearly uncertain. Alara felt her pulse quicken, understanding immediately the trap being laid before them. The very confrontation Kale had wished to avoid now unfolding regardless of their intentions. "That is a bold accusation," Kale said, stepping fully into the hall with Alara close beside him, his voice carrying easily over the murmuring crowd. "Particularly from someone who has offered no evidence beyond his own convenient timing." Draven turned to face them, his expression carefully composed, though something sharp flickered behind his eyes at Alara's presence beside Kale, rather than hidden away, as he had clearly expected. "I offer only concern for this pack's safety, Alpha. Concern I believe many here share." "Concern," Kale repeated evenly, "or opportunity." The hall fell silent, tension thick enough to feel against the skin. Alara understood, in that moment, that whatever happened next would shape far more than the immediate argument between two rivals. It would determine how the entire pack understood her place among them, whether she would forever be seen as a distraction and a liability, or something else entirely. She stepped forward, before she had fully decided to, drawing every eye in the hall toward her. "I did not choose to come here," she said, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her own heart. "I was taken from my home, and offered as a sacrifice, to a creature I had been taught my entire life to fear. I have every reason to resent this place, and yet I have chosen, each day since my arrival, to remain rather than surrender to that fear. That choice is mine, made freely, and it has nothing to do with weakness in your Alpha's leadership." Draven's composed expression flickered, clearly unprepared for her direct challenge. "A pretty speech," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "But speeches do not protect this pack from danger." "No," Alara agreed. "But division does not protect it either. If you truly care for the safety of everyone in this hall, perhaps your energy would be better spent identifying the actual threat responsible for last night's attack, rather than manufacturing doubt about matters that have nothing to do with it." A low murmur of agreement moved through parts of the crowd, and Alara watched Draven's expression tighten further, understanding clearly that his carefully staged confrontation had not unfolded the way he intended. Kale, beside her, said nothing, allowing her words room to settle over the hall without interruption, and something in his silence felt less like passivity and more like quiet trust. "This conversation is not finished," Draven said finally, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration, before turning and striding from the hall, several of his closest followers trailing uncertainly behind him. The remaining pack members dispersed slowly afterward, murmuring quietly among themselves, and Alara felt the exhausted aftermath of adrenaline settle heavily into her limbs. Kale turned to her once the hall had mostly emptied, something like awe mixed with concern in his expression. "That was either very brave," he said quietly, "or very reckless." "Perhaps both," Alara admitted, allowing herself a tired, small smile. "But I meant every word." "I know," Kale said, and the simple certainty in his voice settled something warm and unexpected in Alara's chest, a feeling she was not yet ready to name, but one she no longer felt entirely inclined to push away. In the days following the confrontation in the Great Hall, something within the fortress shifted permanently. Alara noticed it, in small ways at first, a nod of respect from a guard who had once eyed her with suspicion, a warmer greeting from pack members who had previously kept careful distance. Bryn, delighted by the change, teased her relentlessly about becoming something of a local legend among the younger members of the pack, a title Alara accepted with more embarrassment than pride. Kale too seemed different, though the change in him was quieter, harder to name. He sought her company more openly now, no longer retreating into distant duty the moment their conversations grew too personal. Their lessons in the courtyard continued, though they had grown into something less like instruction and more like simple companionship. Long afternoons, spent talking as much as training. The boundary between teacher and student blurring into something neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. It was during one such afternoon, weeks after the confrontation with Draven, that Kale finally told her the full truth of what breaking the curse would require. "There is a ritual chamber," he said, as they sat together on the courtyard steps, deep beneath the fortress, built at the same time the original curse was cast. "It is there that the bond between an alpha and his bride must be sealed, if the curse is ever to be broken." "What does the ritual involve?" "Little more than truth," Kale said. "The chamber recognizes only what is genuine. False vows, forced promises, none of it holds any power there. Only a bond freely chosen and freely spoken can break centuries of curse." Ilara studied him carefully, understanding the weight of what he was suggesting, without him needing to say it outright. "You are asking whether I am ready to make that choice." "I am not asking anything of you yet," Kale said gently. "I only wanted you to understand what waits ahead, so that whatever you eventually decide, you decide with full knowledge rather than uncertainty." Ilara considered this in silence for a long moment, turning over everything she had experienced since the drums had gone silent behind her that first terrible night. She thought of the fear that had carried her into the forest, the defiance that had sustained her through every difficult day since, and the strange, unexpected warmth that had grown slowly between her and the creature the world had taught her to see only as a monster. "I am not ready today," she admitted honestly, "but I do not think that means I will never be ready." "That is enough," Kale said, and the quiet relief in his voice told her more clearly than any words could have how much her honesty meant to him. Their peace, however, did not last long. That evening, as the fortress settled into its usual quiet rhythms, a commotion erupted from the lower corridors, urgent shouts echoing up through the stone hallways. Ilara rushed toward the sound alongside Kale, both of them arriving to find several guards restraining a struggling figure. Draven himself, caught attempting to access the ritual chamber beneath the fortress under cover of darkness. "Explain yourself," Kale demanded, his voice carrying a cold authority Ilara had rarely heard from him before. Draven, held firmly by two guards, lifted his chin with defiant pride rather than shame. "I sought only to understand what threatens this pack's future," he said. "The chamber holds knowledge older than any of us, knowledge I believe you have kept hidden for reasons that serve you, rather than the pack. You sought to sabotage the bond before it could ever be completed," Kale said, understanding settling cold and furious across his features. "You feared exactly what Ilara's presence here threatens, the end of the division you have spent years cultivating for your own benefit." "Careful, Alpha," Draven said, something dangerous flickering behind his dark eyes, despite his restrained position. "Accusations without proof are a poor foundation for justice." "Then let the chamber itself provide the proof," Kale said, turning to the guards. "Bring him. If his intentions were as innocent as he claims, the chamber will reveal that truth as easily as it would reveal a lie." Ilara felt her pulse quicken as they made their way down into the depths of the fortress, following a narrow stone stairway that descended far deeper than she had ever ventured before. The air grew cooler and heavier with each step, thick with the weight of old magic, until they finally emerged into a vast circular chamber, its walls covered in the same strange carvings she had first seen in the gallery weeks earlier, glowing faintly now with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to respond to their presence. Draven was brought forward, and the moment he crossed the chamber's threshold, the glowing carvings flared brighter, pulsing in an agitated rhythm that felt distinctly like alarm. "The chamber recognizes deception," Kale said quietly, watching the light shift and churn along the walls. "Tell us the truth, Draven. What did you intend to do here tonight?" Draven's composed mask finally cracked, frustration and desperation bleeding through the careful control he had maintained for so long. "I intended to break the bond before it could ever be sealed," he admitted, the words seeming to tear free from him despite his obvious reluctance. "I have spent years building support among those who believe the old pact weakens us, who believe our survival depends on abandoning ties to the very humans who once tried to destroy us. If the bond between you and her succeeds, everything I have built collapses." The glowing light along the walls settled into a steady, calm pulse, confirming the honesty of his admission, even as the pack members present absorbed the full weight of his betrayal. Cale's expression remained carefully controlled, though Alara could see the effort it cost him, old trust and long history warring visibly with the necessity of the moment. "You will be confined," Cale said finally, "until the Pack Council can determine an appropriate judgment for your actions. Whatever grievance you hold against the old ways, Draven, you had no right to endanger this entire Pack's future for the sake of your own ambition." Draven said nothing further as the guards led him away, though his eyes lingered on Alara for one final, unreadable moment, before he disappeared up the stairway, leaving the chamber and its restless, glowing light behind him. Alara stood in the sudden quiet that followed, absorbing the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Whatever uncertainty had remained about Draven's true intentions had been settled decisively, and yet the victory brought little comfort, only the sobering understanding of how close the fragile peace within these walls had come to collapsing entirely. "Are you well?" Cale asked quietly, studying her carefully in the dim, pulsing light of the chamber. "I am," Alara said, though her voice carried more uncertainty than she intended. "I only wonder how many others share his beliefs, even if they lacked his willingness to act on them. Perhaps more than I would like to admit," Cale said honestly. "But tonight, at least, the truth has been spoken plainly, in a place that cannot be deceived. That is no small thing." Alara looked around the ancient chamber once more, at the carvings that had flared so violently at the first hint of dishonesty, and felt something settle quietly within her, a growing certainty that whatever choice she eventually made about the bond between them, it would need to be made here, in this very room, where nothing false could survive the weight of its own scrutiny. The days following Draven's exposure brought an uneasy calm to the fortress, the kind that settles after a storm has passed, but before anyone fully trusts the clear sky above them. The Pack Council, a group of elder members Alara had rarely interacted with directly, met to determine Draven's fate, and the decision, when it finally came, surprised her with its measured restraint. Rather than exile or harsher punishment, Draven was to be stripped of his standing among the Pack's inner circle, and confined to closely monitored duties on the fortress's outer boundary, far from any position of influence. "Some believe mercy invites further betrayal," Cale admitted to her one evening, as they walked together along the same forest path, where he had first told her the story of the ancient war. "But exile would only send his resentment beyond these walls, where I could no longer watch its growth. Better, I think, to keep him close enough to observe, and to remind him daily of the consequences his ambition nearly earned him." "You are kinder than I expected an alpha to be," Alara observed. "Or perhaps simply more practical," Cale said, though something in his tone suggested he did not entirely disagree with her assessment. Not everyone within the pack accepted the council's decision without complaint. Alara noticed, in the days that followed, small pockets of quiet resentment among those who had once aligned themselves with Draven's ambitions, whispers that suggested his punishment had been too lenient, that his warnings about the old pack's dangers still held merit, despite his failed attempt to sabotage the bond directly. It was a reminder, uncomfortable but necessary, that Draven's defeat had not resolved the deeper divisions his ambitions had merely exploited. Alara found herself thinking often, in the quiet hours before sleep, about the choice that still waited for her in the depths of the fortress, the ritual chamber, and the bond it demanded. She was no longer the frightened, defiant girl who had walked barefoot into the hollow wood, certain she was meeting her own end. She had grown, in the weeks since, into someone who understood this strange world far more deeply, who had built genuine friendships within walls she had once feared entirely, who found herself, more often than she was fully prepared to admit, looking forward to the quiet moments she shared with Cale, rather than dreading them. And yet the weight of the choice remained. To complete the bond meant accepting a life entirely different from anything she had once imagined for herself, a permanent departure from Halomir and everything familiar, a commitment not just to Cale, but to an entire pack still healing from the wounds of Draven's betrayal. It was not a decision to be made lightly, however much her growing feelings for Cale might have wished otherwise. It was Bryn, in the end, who helped her find clarity, during a quiet afternoon spent together in the kitchens, hands busy with simple, familiar work that left plenty of room for honest conversation. "You are afraid of choosing wrong," Bryn observed, not unkindly, as she watched Alara knead dough with more force than the task strictly required. "I am afraid of choosing for the wrong reasons," Alara admitted. "How do I know whether I want this because it is truly what I want, or because the alternative, returning to a village that offered me up like livestock, feels so much worse by comparison?" Bryn considered this carefully before answering. "Perhaps," she said, "you are asking the wrong question entirely. It does not matter how you arrived at this choice, only whether the choice itself feels true when you finally make it. My own mother came here through fear, generations ago, much as you did, but she chose to stay because of what she found here, not because of what she fled. There is no shame in that, Alara. Sometimes the best things in our lives begin with circumstances we never would have chosen for ourselves." Alara turned this over carefully, the truth of it settling slowly into place, alongside everything else she had learned since her arrival. She thought of Cale's patience, his honesty, even when honesty cost him comfort, the quiet respect he had shown her from the very first night in the clearing, when he could easily have demanded obedience instead. She thought of the pack itself, flawed and fractured as it currently was, but filled with people who had shown her, in their own ways, more genuine welcome than Halomir ever had. That evening, she found Cale alone in the courtyard, watching the last light fade from the sky above the tree line. He turned as she approached, something hopeful and uncertain flickering across his face when he saw the resolve in her expression. "I am ready," she said simply, before he could ask. Cale studied her carefully, searching her face for any trace of doubt or hesitation. "You do not have to decide tonight," he said gently. "There is no urgency that requires rushing this choice." "I know," Alara said, "but I am not rushing. I have spent weeks turning this decision over, weighing every fear and every hope I carry. I am not choosing this because the curse demands it, or because Draven's schemes forced my hand, or even because I fear what returning to Halomir might mean for me now. I am choosing it because, somewhere between that clearing and this courtyard, this place became something I want to protect, rather than simply survive." Something in Cale's expression shifted, old weariness giving way to a hope he seemed almost afraid to fully embrace. "And what of me?" he asked quietly. "Is this choice about the fortress, the pack, the life you have built here, or is it also about the creature who dragged you into all of it?" Alara stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze, the same way she had on that very first night in the clearing, though everything about the moment now felt entirely different. "It is about you too, Cale," she said honestly. "More than I expected it to be, when I first refused to bow to you." "You still have not bowed," Cale pointed out, something warm and unguarded finally breaking free in his expression. "No," Alara agreed, allowing herself a small, genuine smile. "I do not intend to start now. But I am ready to stand beside you, if you will have me." Cale reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, and gently took her hand in his own. "I would have no other way," he said quietly. "Not fear, not obedience, only this, exactly as you have offered it." They stood together in the fading light of the courtyard, the fortress settling into evening quiet around them, and for the first time since the drums of Halomir had gone silent behind her, Alara felt something close to peace settle fully into her chest, no longer the hard, cold stone she had carried into the forest, but something warmer, something chosen freely and without regret. The night chosen for the ritual arrived beneath a sky heavy with stars, the kind of clear darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly above the ancient trees of the hollow wood. Word had spread quickly through the fortress once the Pack Council confirmed the bonding would proceed, and Alara found herself, in the hours before the ritual, surrounded by a warmth she never could have anticipated on that first terrifying night months earlier. Bryn helped her prepare, weaving small blue flowers, the same shade as the strange marsh lights that marked the forest's boundary, through her hair with careful, practiced hands. "You are shaking," Bryn observed gently. "I am not afraid," Alara said, though her voice trembled slightly with the admission. "I did not say you were afraid," Bryn replied, smiling. "There is a difference between fear and simply feeling the weight of something important." Alara took a steadying breath, absorbing the truth of that distinction. She was not the frightened girl who had once been led barefoot into these trees, bound and expecting death. She was choosing this, deliberately and with open eyes, and the trembling in her hands came not from dread, but from the enormity of a choice she intended to honor completely. As she made her way down toward the ritual chamber, guided by Bryn and flanked by pack members who had once regarded her with wary suspicion, but now offered quiet nods of respect, Ilara caught sight of Draven standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them that was not quite forgiveness, but was, perhaps, the beginning of an uneasy truce, an acknowledgement that whatever came next would happen regardless of his objections, and that the pack itself had already chosen its path forward. The descent into the chamber felt different this time, the cool stone air no longer threatening but charged instead with anticipation. Cale waited for her at the chamber's center, dressed simply, his amber eyes catching the soft, pulsing light of the ancient carvings that lined the walls. He looked, Ilara thought, less like the fearsome monster alpha of Halomir's old stories, and more like exactly what he was, someone who had carried an old, unfair burden for far longer than any single person should have to bear alone. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly, one final time, as she came to stand before him. "I know," Ilara said. "I am doing it anyway." The eldest member of the Pack Council, a woman named Isolde, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of quiet patience, stepped forward to guide the ritual's proceedings. "The chamber recognizes only truth," she said, her voice carrying easily through the silent room. "Speak honestly, or do not speak at all." Cale turned to face Ilara fully, taking both her hands in his own. "I did not choose the curse that brought you here," he said, the words clearly meant for the chamber, as much as for her. "But I choose, freely and without hesitation, to stand beside you, not as my subject, but as my equal, for as long as you will have me." The carvings along the walls pulsed brighter at his words, a warm golden light replacing the pale blue glow that had marked the chamber before, and Ilara felt something shift in the very air around them, ancient magic recognizing the honesty of his vow. She drew a steadying breath, holding his gaze as she spoke her own truth in return. "I was brought here as a sacrifice," she said, bound and afraid, expecting nothing but an ending. "Instead, I found a home I never anticipated, a pack that welcomed me, despite every reason for suspicion, and a man who taught me that strength is not the same as force, and that choice, freely made, matters more than any tradition or curse could ever demand. I choose you, Cale, not because I have no other option, but because, of every option I have discovered since that first night in the clearing, this is the one I want most." The golden light along the walls surged brighter still, spreading outward, until the entire chamber seemed to glow with warm, pulsing radiance, and Ilara felt something ancient and heavy lift away from the air around them, centuries of curse finally releasing its hold. Cale's eyes widened slightly, wonder breaking through his usual composed calm, and Ilara realized, watching the light settle into a steady, peaceful glow, that they had done it. The curse that had bound generations of alphas to loneliness and forced sacrifice had finally broken, not through force or magic wielded against it, but through the simple, undeniable truth of a choice made freely by two people who had found something real between them. A cheer rose from the gathered pack members watching from the chamber's edges, relief and joy breaking loose after weeks of tension and uncertainty. Even Draven, standing near the back of the crowd, offered a small, grudging nod, acknowledgement that whatever he had once believed about the old pack's weakness, the truth unfolding before him, could not be denied. "It is done," Isolde said, her ancient eyes bright with something like tears. "The curse that has haunted this bloodline for centuries is finally broken." Cale pulled Ilara close, resting his forehead gently against hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply absorbing the enormity of what had just occurred. The weight of an old and terrible curse lifted at last, by nothing more complicated than honest choice, freely given and freely received. "Thank you," Cale said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "You do not need to thank me," Ilara said, smiling despite the tears gathering unexpectedly in her own eyes. "I chose this because I wanted to, Cale, not because it was owed to you, or to your pack, or even to the memory of every woman who came before me. I chose it because somewhere between that clearing and this chamber, you became someone I wanted to stand beside." Around them, the pack's celebration continued, warm and genuine, and Ilara allowed herself, finally, to feel fully at peace within walls she had once entered, bound and afraid, now standing free and chosen, exactly as she had always insisted she would. In the months that followed the breaking of the curse, the hollow wood itself seemed to change, though whether the forest had truly shifted, or whether Alara simply saw it differently now, she could never quite decide. The strange blue marsh lights that had once seemed so eerie on her first terrified walk through the trees, now felt familiar, almost comforting, marking the boundaries of a home she had come to love rather than fear. The fortress, once an intimidating stone structure looming out of the darkness, had become simply that, a home, filled with familiar voices and warm firelight and the easy rhythms of a life she had chosen for herself. The pack itself had changed as well, healing slowly from the divisions Draven's ambitions had exposed. He remained among them still, his standing diminished but his presence tolerated, a living reminder of how close old resentments had come to unraveling everything Kale had worked to build. Alara found, to her own surprise, that she held little lingering anger toward him. His fear of change, however poorly expressed, had come from a real place, and the pack's healing depended not on erasing that fear entirely, but on proving, through steady example, that the old ways need not remain frozen in place forever. Bryn had become, over those months, something closer to a true sister than Alara had ever expected to find so far from Halomir, and their friendship anchored her through the strange, ongoing adjustment of building a life so different from the one she had once imagined for herself as a young woman in the village. Word had reached Halomir eventually, carried by traders who ventured near enough to the forest's edge to hear rumors of a sacrifice, who had not simply survived, but had broken a centuries-old curse through nothing more than her own unwavering will. Alara did not know what the village made of that news, whether Cormac Ashby and the other elders felt any shame at all for the pact they had upheld so blindly for generations. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she no longer needed their acknowledgement to feel at peace with everything that had happened. Kale, freed at last from the isolation that had haunted every alpha before him, seemed to Alara like a different person than the watchful, guarded creature who had emerged from the trees on that first terrible night, though the change had been gradual enough that she had barely noticed it happening in real time. He laughed more easily now, spent long evenings in genuine conversation rather than careful, measured caution, and the weight that had once seemed permanently settled behind his amber eyes had lifted into something closer to quiet contentment. "I used to wonder," he admitted to her one evening, as they sat together on the same courtyard steps, where he had first taught her the difference between strength and force, whether I was capable of the kind of bond the curse demanded. Whether I had been shaped too thoroughly by isolation to ever truly welcome someone standing beside me as an equal, rather than beneath me as tradition required. "And now?" Alara asked, leaning her head against his shoulder, comfortable in a closeness that would have seemed impossible to her on that first frightened walk through the hollow wood. "Now I understand that I was simply waiting," Kale said quietly, "for someone who refused to let me hide behind old fears any longer than she had to." Alara smiled, thinking back to the girl who had sat on that stone altar in the clearing, bound and terrified but refusing to kneel, refusing to let fear dictate the shape of her final moments, even when she believed those moments might truly be her last. That girl had not known, could not have known, that her defiance would lead her here, to this quiet courtyard, this unexpected home, this steady, hard-won love built not on tradition or curse or fear, but on genuine choice, made freely by two people who had found, against every reasonable expectation, exactly what they needed in one another. The forest around the fortress stretched wide and ancient in every direction, no longer a place of dread but simply home, filled with the quiet, ongoing business of a pack rebuilding itself after generations of old wounds, learning slowly what it meant to move forward without the shadow of a curse hanging over every new bond formed within its borders. Alara knew there would be challenges still ahead, disagreements to navigate, old resentments that might never fully heal, the ordinary difficulties of any life built between two very different worlds. But she faced those uncertain days now, not with the hard, cold resolve of a girl bracing herself against fate, but with the steady, hopeful confidence of a woman who had chosen her own path and found it, against every expectation, worth every difficult step that had led her there. "I never bowed to you," she reminded Kale softly, watching the last light of evening settle golden over the treetops. "No," Kale agreed. pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. Warmth and quiet joy threaded through every word. You never did, and I would not have it any other way. Together, they watched the sun set over the hollow wood, two equals bound not by ancient curse or forced tradition, but by a choice made freely, in a chamber deep beneath the earth, on a night when truth alone had proven powerful enough to break centuries of loneliness, and to build, in its place, something real, something chosen, and something that would, at last, endure.